The Charlotte Kohler was 30 years old when she and her husband and young daughter boarded the Titanic. They sold everything to start a new, happier life in the United States. But that life never came. This salvation story is still a chilling reminder that the Titanic disaster is about grief and the wrecking of real people's lives. But before you watch this video, I have a small favor. If you like it, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel and leave your comments. It won't be hard for you and it will be motivation for me to keep making good content. Thank you. Of all the things I remember about the Titanic disaster, one impression that will never leave me is the irony of the hope I felt on the ship. It's unsinkable. I was told it was the safest ship in the world. I'd never traveled on the sea and so I was afraid of it. But I've heard people say, get on the new Titanic, you'll be safe on it. The new technological advances make it safe, and yes, the officers on the maiden voyage will be very careful. So me, Harvey, my husband and our 8-year-old daughter Marjorie decided to go to America this way. Marjorie and I are safe here now. But there are only 2 of us left. My husband sank with the Titanic to the bottom of the Atlantic. Everything we ever had was gone. First, I want to tell you why we decided to leave England. We lived in a small village in Hampshire. My husband ran a grocery store. In his 35 years he was the main man in the village and was loved by all the neighbors. He was also the clerk at the church, helping to fill in birth certificates, marriage contracts and so on. He was also the local bell ringer in the main bell tower, which is over 100 years old and is considered one of the best in England. One day some friends of ours went to the American states of Idaho. They bought a fruit farm and kept it quite successfully. In their letters to us they told us what a wonderful climate it was and invited us to join them. Eventually, we decided to sell our business and buy a small farm in the same place as our friends. I realized that it was only for me and for Marjorie. If it hadn't been for us, Harvey would never have left England. My husband took all our money out of the bank, including the money we got from the sale of our store. Thus, we received a sum of several thousand American dollars in cash. All this, my husband folded the largest pocket of his jacket. Before this, we had already sent our small luggage to the ship, and so when we boarded the Titanic, we had our greatest wealth with us. We were traveling second class, and from our cabin we could see the magnitude with which the ship was seen off. I don't think I have ever seen such a large crowd before. The Titanic was beautiful, much more beautiful than I could have imagined. The other ships looked like walnut shells next to it. They were, I assure you, a few years ago, they were considered huge. I remember a friend saying to me, just before everyone was asked to leave, "Aren't you afraid of traveling by sea?" But now I was sure that even the worst storm couldn't hurt this ship. Before leaving the bay I had seen an incident with the New York, a liner that had pulled away from the wharf right across to us, but it did not frighten, but on the contrary only assured us how powerful the Titanic was. I don't remember much about the first few days of the voyage. I was a little seasick, so I spent almost all my time in my cabin. For Sunday, April 14, 1912 my health improved. I dined in the parlor, enjoyed the food, which was even too much and it was too good. On Sunday even the service of the second class no effort was spared, and it was a most excellent dinner. After I had had my fill, I listened to the orchestra for a little while, and at 9 o'clock or 10:30 in the evening I went to my cabin. I had just lain down when the stewardess came in to see me. She was a pleasant woman and very kind to me. I want to take this opportunity to thank her, for I shall never see her again. She sank with the Titanic. "Do you know where we are now?" she asked politely. "We are in a place called the Devil's Hole." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It's a dangerous place in the ocean," she answered. "A lot of accidents have happened near this spot. They say icebergs go even farther than this point. It's getting very cold on deck, so the ice is nearby." She left the cabin and I went back to sleep. Her talk of icebergs didn't scare me, but it meant the crew was worried about them. As far as I could remember, we didn't slow down at all. About 10 o'clock, my husband came in and woke me up. He told me something, I don't remember for how long. Then he started getting ready for bed, and then there was a bang. It seemed to me that someone took the ship with a big hand and shook it once, and then everything went silent. I did not fall from the bed, and my husband, who was still standing on his feet, only shook a little. We didn't hear any strange noises, no scraping of metal or wood. But we noticed that the engines had stopped. They started again a few minutes later. But after some rumbling again. After some rumbling, there was silence again. Our cabin was located so that we could hear it all clearly. Neither I nor my husband were concerned. He said that something must have happened in the engine room, and at first even wanted to go on deck, then he changed his mind. He put on his coat and left me. I lay quietly in bed with my little girl and almost fell asleep again. A few moments later, as it seemed to me, my husband returned. He was indeed a little excited. "Just think of it," he exclaimed, "we have run into an iceberg, a rather large one, but there's no danger, that's what the officer told me." I could hear the footsteps of the men on the deck above me. I could hear some thumps, noises, and creaks. It was like someone was straining the ship's gears. I saw 5 professional hustlers playing with the passengers as I stepped out, their cards scattered across the table when the collision occurred, and now the players were hastily collecting them. This account convinced me. If these card-playing people are not worried, why should I be worried? I think my husband would be back to sleep, no longer interested in the incident. When we heard the stomping of hundreds of people running outside our door, they weren't screaming, but the stomping of their feet reminded me of rats running through an empty room. I saw my face in the reflection of the mirror and it turned very pale. My husband turned pale too. Cursing, he told me, "We better go upstairs to the deck and see what's wrong." I jumped out of bed, put on my evening dress and coat. My hair was loose, but I hastily gathered it up. By this time, although there was no sign of collision, the ship seemed to tilt forward a bit. I grabbed my daughter Marjorie in her pajamas, wrapped her in plaid, and sprinted out the door. My husband followed us. Neither of us took any of our belongings from the cabin. I even remember my husband leaving his watch on the pillow. We didn't doubt for a second that we were coming back here. After all, when we reached the second-class promenade deck, we saw a large crowd of people. Some officers were walking back and forth, shouting out, "There is no danger." It was a clear starry night, but very cold. The ocean was immovable. Some passengers stood at the guardrail and looked down, but it is worth noting that no one feared anything at that time. It was either 5th Officer Lowe or 1st Officer Murdoch and asked him something. I heard him yell back, "No, we don't have no searchlights, but we do have missiles on board. Stay calm. There's no danger." The 3 of us held together. I didn't recognize the faces around me. Maybe it was the excitement. I had never gone to the first-class facilities, so I didn't see any known people. Suddenly the crowd near one of the gangways buzzed and we saw a stoker coming up from below. He stopped a few meters away from us, the fingers of one of his hands were cut off, blood gushing from the stump, splattering his clothes and face. The bloody marks could be seen very clearly on his black, sooty skin. I decided to ask him if there was any danger. "Danger?" he shrieked. "Well, I guess. It's hell down there. Look at me. This ship will sink in 10 minutes. Then he stumbled and fell into a pile of ropes, losing consciousness. At that moment I felt the first attack of fear, a horrible, sickening fear. The sight of this poor man with a bleeding hand, a splattered face conjured up in my mind a picture of ruined engines and mutilated human bodies. I grasped my husband's hand, and although he was very courageous and not trembling with fear, I saw his face as white as a sheet of paper. We realized that the accident was much more serious than we had expected, but even then neither I nor any of the people around us believed that the Titanic could sink. Officers were running from one place to another, giving orders. I don't remember exactly what was happening. For the next quarter of an hour, time seemed much shorter, but about 10 or 15 minutes later, I saw First Officer Murdoch putting guards at the gangways to keep other wounded stokers off the deck. I don't know how many men were cut off from their chance of rescue, but Mr. Murdoch was probably right. He was an experienced man, amazingly brave and cold-blooded. I met him the day before the disaster when he was checking out the second-grade room, and I thought he looked like a bulldog. Not afraid of anything. That turned out to be true. He followed orders to the very end and died at his post. They say he shot himself. I don't know. They must have sent us to the boat deck, because after a while I realized that's where I was. I was still holding my husband's hand and holding Marjorie close to me. Many women were standing there with their husbands. There was no confusion or confusion. Suddenly a terrible cry went up over the crowd of people asking each other what was happening. Lower the boats. Women and children first. Someone repeated the last words over and over again. Women and children first. Women and children first. Women and children first. They planted a deep dread in my heart, and they will echo in my head until the day I die. They meant I was safe, but they also meant the greatest loss of my life. The loss of my husband. The first dinghy quickly filled and launched, and few men boarded, and that was 6 crew members. The male passengers made no attempt to escape. I had never seen such bravery, and I didn't think it was possible. How people in first or third class behaved I don't know, but our men were real heroes. I want all readers of this story to know that. The launching of the second dinghy took longer. It seems to me that all the women who were truly afraid and wanted to save themselves had already done so in the first dinghy. The remaining women were mostly either wives who didn't want to leave their husbands, or daughters who didn't want to leave their parents. The officer in charge here on deck was Harold Lowe. And First Officer Murdoch went to the other side of the deck. I never saw him again. Mr. Lowe was very young, but somehow he managed to convince people to follow his orders. He went into the crowd and ordered the women to get into the dinghies. Many of them followed him as if hypnotized, but some stayed with their men. I could have gotten into the second boat, but I refused. At last she was filled and disappeared into the darkness. There were still 2 more dinghies left on this part of the deck. A man in light-colored clothing fussed about, shouting instructions. I saw Lowe's 5th officer, ordering him to get out. I didn't recognize him, but then I read in the paper that it was Mr. Bruce Ismay, the acting director of the company. The third dinghy was half full when a sailor grabbed Marjorie, my daughter, snatched her from me and threw her into the dinghy and didn't even give her a chance to say goodbye to her father. You too! A man shouted in my ear. You woman, take a seat in the dinghy or it will be too late. The deck seemed to move out from under my feet. The ship tilted quite a bit as it was already sinking faster. I rushed to my husband in desperation. I don't remember what I said, but I'll always be happy to think that I didn't want to leave him. The man pulled me by the arm, then the other put his arm around my waist and yanked me as hard as he could. I heard my husband say, "Go Lottie, for God's sake be brave. Go! I'll find a place in the other dinghy." The men holding me dragged me across the deck and roughly threw me into the dinghy. I fell on my shoulder and hurt it. The other women crowded around me, but I jumped to my feet so that I could see my husband over their heads. He had already turned away and was walking slowly down the deck until he disappeared among the men. I never saw him again, but I know that he walked towards his death without fear. His last words, that he would find a place in another lifeboat, cheered me up. Until the last moment, when all hope was lost. Many women have been promised the same thing by their husbands. Otherwise, they would have jumped into the water, gone to the bottom. I let myself be saved, only because I believed he would be saved too, but sometimes I envy those women whom no force could tear them away from their husbands. There were several such, and they stood with their loved ones to the very end, and when the roll call of the passengers on the Carpathia was arranged for the next day, they did not call back. The dinghy was nearly full. There were no women left near when Mr. Lowe jumped into it and ordered it lowered. The sailors on deck began to carry out the order when one unfortunate incident occurred. A young red-cheeked lad not much older than a schoolboy, young enough to be considered a boy, was standing close to the railings. He made no attempt to escape, though his eyes were constantly drilling the officer. Now that he realized that he could really stay on the ship, his courage deserted him. With a scream, he climbed the railing and jumped into the dinghy. He got into the thick of us women and hid under a bench. I and the other women covered him with our skirts. We wanted to give the poor man a chance, but the officer pulled him by the leg and ordered him back to the ship. The poor man begged to be given a chance. I remember him saying he wouldn't take much room, but the officer pulled out his revolver and put it to the guy's face. "I'm giving you 10 seconds to get back to the ship before I blow your brains out." Poor guy begged even harder. I thought the officer was going to shoot him, but Officer Lowe suddenly softened his tone. He lowered his revolver and looked the boy directly into his eyes. "For God's sake, be a man. We have yet to save the women and children. We'll stop in the lower decks and take them in reverse." The boy averted his eyes and strode to the deck. Without uttering a word, he took a few uncertain steps, then lay down on the deck and wept. He was not saved. All the women around me were sobbing. I saw my little Marjorie take the officer's hand. "Uncle Officer, don't shoot. Please don't shoot this poor man." The officer nodded in response and even smiled. He gave the order to continue the descent. As we were going down, a third-class passenger, an Italian I think, rushed across the deck to us and jumped into the dinghy. He fell on a child who hit him hard. The officer pulled him by the collar and with all his might threw him back onto the Titanic. As we made our way down to the water, I took one last look at the crowd. This Italian man was in the hands of about 12 second-class men. They were punching him in the face and blood was coming out of his mouth and nose. As it turned out, we didn't stop at any floors to pick up women and children. It was impossible, I think. When we touched the water, we were jolted by an incredible force, almost throwing us overboard, and the men took oars and began to row quickly away from the wreck. Soon, I saw the very iceberg that had done so much damage. It towered against the bright night sky, a huge blue and white mountain near us. The other two icebergs were close by, like the peak of a mountain. Later, I think I saw 3 or 4 more. But I'm not sure. Shallow ice was floating in the water. It was very cold. We had sailed a mile or so when the officer ordered the men to stop rowing. There were no lifeboats nearby, and we didn't even have rockets to signal. We stopped here in the middle of the ocean in silence and total darkness. I will never forget the terrifying beauty of the Titanic at that moment. It leaned forward, stern in the air. The first tube half in the water. Everything was lit up, every cabin, every deck, and the lights on the masts. No sounds reached us except the music of the orchestra, which I, strangely enough, for the first time, became anxious about. Oh, those brave musicians! How wonderful they were! They played cheerful ragtime tunes and continued to do so to the very end. Only the encroaching ocean was able to plunge into silence. From a distance, it was impossible to distinguish anyone on board, but I could see groups of men on each deck. They stood with their arms crossed and their heads down. I'm sure they were praying. The orchestra was playing, "Closer to You, Lord." I heard it clearly. I heard a sound that deafened me. Something in the bowels of the Titanic exploded and millions of sparks shot up into the sky like fireworks on a summer evening. These sparks scattered in all directions like a fountain, followed by 2 more explosions, distant and deafening, as if underwater. The Titanic broke in 2 right in front of me. The front part was partly in the water, and after the break it sank rapidly and disappeared instantly. The stern stood on its haunches and stood that way for a very long time. It seemed to me to last for minutes, and only then did the lights go out. On the ship before darkness fell, I saw hundreds of human bodies climbing on the ship or pitching into the water. The Titanic seemed like a swarm of bees, but instead of bees there were men, and now they were no longer silent. I heard the most horrible screams I could ever hear and turned away, but the next moment I turned back and saw the back of the ship disappear under the water like a stone thrown into a pond. I will always remember that moment as the most horrifying moment in the disaster. Many cries for help echoed from the wreck site, but Officer Lode told the women who asked him to return that it would sink everyone in the dinghy. I'm guessing some of the lifeboats were picking up survivors at the time. I was later told by a person I trust that Captain Smith was washed into the water, but then he swam out by the collapsible dinghy holding onto it for a while. A member of the crew assured me that he tried to hoist him aboard, but he shook his head in the negative, broke away from the dinghy and disappeared from sight. As for us, we went in search of other dinghies. We found 4 or 5, and Mr. Lowe took command of this little fleet. He ordered the dinghies to be connected to each other by ropes, so that none could become detached and lost in the darkness. This plan proved very useful, especially when the Carpathia arrived to rescue us. Lowe then redistributed the women from our dinghy to the others with great difficulty. This took about half an hour. The dinghy became almost empty and the officer cut off the rope and went in search of survivors, and then finally we were aboard the Carpathia. There were over 700 of us, and the tragedy we experienced could not be described in words. There was hardly anyone here who had not lost a husband, a child, or a friend. People wandered from one group of people to another, watching the excited faces of the rescued, shouting names and asking endless questions. I was looking for my husband, who I believed until the very last moment would be found in one of the lifeboats, and he was not here. And those are the best words to end my story of the Titanic. Friends in America have treated us well. I hope to follow the original plan. I will go to Idaho and try to build a new home in a new world. For a while I thought about going back to England, but it is unlikely that I will ever be able to look at the ocean again. Moreover, I must take Marjorie to where her father wished to send the two of us. That's all I care about now. To do what he hoped to do. Charlotte and Marjorie did indeed go to Idaho after the disaster. However, it soon became apparent that without her husband it was impossible to organize a farm or other farming operation in the unfamiliar land. With the money received from the many readers of the newspaper where Charlotte's article was published, Charlotte and Marjorie returned to England. Unfortunately, their misfortunes were not over. In 1914, Charlotte contracted tuberculosis and passed away. Marjorie grew up and married, but before her death in 1965 at the age of 61, she was widowed. And her only child died in infancy. In 1955, she wrote a book, Life After the Titanic. And in the memories there was this phrase, "Since that time I lived under the shadow of misfortune and always wondered if it would ever end, but I think it's my destiny." If you liked this video, please like and subscribe to the channel.